Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. We're looking at the fascinating and honestly deeply illogical world of the medieval knight. When we think of knights, we usually picture these noble, chivalrous heroes making flawlessly brave decisions. But the historical reality? Well, it's a lot messier. This entire elite class was systematically conditioned to make terrible, life-ending decisions on a surprisingly regular basis. Today, we're going to examine exactly how a culture managed to take perfectly normal positive virtues, like courage, and twist them until they became absolutely destructive, reckless habits.
So we really have to ask, why on earth did Europe's elite warriors actively seek out such terrible odds? I mean, history is just packed with examples of knights willingly attacking forces way larger than their own, or charging straight into obvious tactical disasters. Were these heavily armored guys literally insane? Or were they actually the highly logical products of an insane cultural system? To figure that out, we've got to understand the incredibly strict social rules they live by.
And to really get them, we have to look at how they handled insults compared to us. Think about it. If someone insults you online today, the mature, recommended response is to just block the troll, ignore it, and move on, right? But a medieval knight would find that deeply, deeply confusing. If a fellow nobleman raised a questioning eyebrow at a knight's bravery during a banquet, that knight wouldn't just brush it off. No way. He would plunge entire regions into decades of bloody warfare over that minor slight. Letting an insult slide wasn't taking the high road. It was literal social suicide.
Which brings us to Section 1, Training from the Nursery. You see, this reckless behavior wasn't just a sudden, heat-of-the-moment choice made by adults. It was the result of a lifelong pipeline of intense psychological conditioning. At just 7 years old, noble boys were pulled from their families to serve as pages. While modern parents stress over screen time, medieval parents were handing their 7-year-olds wooden swords and actively encouraging mock battles. By their teens, they were squires, witnessing brutal battlefield violence firsthand. War was literally the background scenery of their adolescence. So by adulthood, they were entirely stripped of caution and taught that their sole worth was tied to combat.
And during all those formative years, they were force-fed these epic tales of legendary heroes like King Arthur charging into impossible situations and coming out covered in glory. I mean, nobody ever sat these kids down to tell the thrilling tale of Sir Geoffrey the reasonably prepared, who carefully assessed risks and lived to a comfortable old age, right? They learned super early on that surviving carefully was an absolute disgrace compared to dying boldly.
Moving right along to Section 2, the currency of honor. Now, honor is probably the most dangerous word in the medieval vocabulary. It wasn't just some internal moral compass or private sense of pride. Honor was their literal social currency. It completely dictated their wealth, their political alliances, and even their marriage prospects. A single perceived moment of weakness could financially and politically ruin a noble family forever. Honor opened doors, and losing it slammed them shut for good.
Because honor existed entirely in the eyes of others, backing down from a fight was never, ever seen as the mature solution. It was seen as unforgivable weakness. As the historical record shows, their culture actively rewarded bold responses and heavily punished restraint. If a knight escalated a situation, well, he could at least claim he was protecting his honor. Treating every minor disagreement as a life-or-death test of character wasn't an overreaction to them. It was the only logical way to survive in their world.
All right, Section 3, Accelerants, Tournaments, and Tales.
If the fundamental rules of their society weren't dangerous enough, the entertainment of the era basically poured gasoline onto the fire of their oversized egos. Between massive bloody tournament melees that glorified absolute recklessness and those fictional chivalric romances, knights literally started treating real warfare like they were the main character in a fantasy novel. And believe it or not, they treated war like a fashion show too. They rocked extravagant fashion trends like wearing shoes with absurdly long pointed toes just to ensure they looked incredible while risking their lives. And things only escalated. When Pope Urban II called for the Crusades in 1095, it created this terrifying loophole. Before this, the church's message of peace awkwardly clashed with the knight's actual day job of, hitting people with metal objects. But the Crusades? Suddenly, a knight could satisfy his bloodlust, gain immense social fame, and secure his eternal salvation, all at once. Society and heaven were suddenly cheering him on.
This combination created a warrior class that viewed peace as a deeply boring interruption. When there were no major campaigns, these highly trained guys got really restless. I mean, managing a farm is incredibly dull compared to the thrill of a cavalry charge.
Lacking a proper war, they'd literally start violent neighborhood sieges over things as trivial as 3 misplaced goats, just to keep their honor sharp.
So what happens next? Section 4. Reality meets the longbow.
What actually happens when an ego-driven warrior class meets the cold, mathematical reality of evolving technology? Well, the romantic ideal of individual combat absolutely shattered. For centuries, the old rules said that individual bravery, expensive armor, and elite status made you unstoppable. But the new rules of warfare were all about discipline, mass infantry, the English longbow, and gunpowder. Math and logistics were taking over, and frankly, logistics have never been quite as glamorous as heroism.
At massive disasters like the battles of Crécy and Agincourt, heavily armored French knights repeatedly charged into thick mud and devastating arrow fire. Why on earth would they do that? Simply because the idea of waiting for better terrain or, heaven forbid, retreating felt far too shameful to endure. Their cultural programming told them that hesitation was cowardice, and charging forward was literally the only honorable option.
And it's a staggering irony that their desperate need to look heroic made them perfectly predictable. A pragmatic, low-born peasant archer could now easily kill a nobleman who had spent decades and an absolute fortune training for war. The knights were stubbornly playing by the rules of a romance novel, while the archers were just playing by the rules of physics.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, the price of extreme virtue. So, what does this bizarre historical pipeline actually teach us today? Well, the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that these men weren't clinically insane. They were simply participating in a system that took genuinely good, positive qualities, things like courage, confidence, and loyalty, and pushed them until they became fatal, destructive extremes. Courage was pushed into pure recklessness, confidence was warped into arrogance, and loyalty devolved into blind devotion to a completely broken system. They were just humans wearing 60 pounds of steel, doing exactly what their society demanded.
As we wrap up this explainer and look back at the armor and the tragic battlefields, we have to ask ourselves a pretty challenging question. What cultural pressures are we blindly following right now? What perfectly normal modern virtues are we currently pushing to such destructive extremes that future historians will look back at us and call our behavior totally